Hi, Bill.
Good morning.
Welcome to Sooner Than You Think.
Yeah, welcome. Pleasure to be here.
It's possible that there are some people here in our audience that don't know what you do, what the National Counterintelligence and Security Center is. So why don't you start by talking a little bit about your mandate?
Thank you, Brad. So our organization, the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, or NCSC, is a body that was proposed and legislated by U.S. Congress to lead our counterintelligence and security apparatus of the United States government. We are responsible for policies and strategies overarching not only the intelligence community, all of government, but also in the private sector of the U.S.
And for the first time, this is a confirmation position. And in fact, the Senate is voting on your confirmation today, we think.
Yes, allegedly that'll be an opportunity. I had my confirmation hearing last week. It's the first time this position has been elevated to a presidential appointee and Senate confirmed position.
Well, so if it's a thumbs down, we might need to end this discussion a little early.
That's correct.
But apparently it will not be. So we're going to talk about the global supply chain. We're going to talk about the elections, and then we're going to step back and talk about computer security as a national security priority. But first, I want to start with the global supply chain and a company that's been in the news a lot lately, ZTE. You said in your Senate confirmation hearing that you thought Chinese telecommunications firms are used as a vehicle to conduct espionage. You even told Marco Rubio you would not use a ZTE phone. I presume Huawei, you might have the same problems. And yet, the U.S. presidential administration and China are now talking about taking a step back on some of those restrictions on ZTE to save the company. Why this inconsistency in the federal response to ZTE?
Well, Brad, I think that's a good question, and I think I'd like to start on the first side of that about what the threat is. And I think the intelligence community, the United States government, as well as Europe, and not only the law enforcement folks, have been very clear about the threat posed by China telecom companies. I think when we look at the auspices of how China operates, there's really no bifurcation between the government and the private sector and companies and businesses, which makes it very advantageous for them, but disadvantageous for the rest of the world when you can merge your government apparatus with your private sector. And I think if we all think about what that would look like for us, it would be pretty amazing, but we don't do it. That provides a risk for us in the U.S. and I would say globally to understand the capabilities that a company, a China telecommunication company brings to bear when you could have all the government resources play in that game. It makes it very disconcerting, not only to respect to the market share, but also what the capabilities are for a surveillance perspective.
Okay, so if what you say is true, punishing a company like ZTE, particularly for doing business with Iran and North Korea, as it was accused of doing, makes a certain amount of sense. So, why is the Trump administration then taking a step back?
Yeah, so I'm not really familiar with the latest update on what our administration is doing, but I can tell you that a year or two ago, that company was charged by the U.S. Commerce Department for violating a whole slew of things and was forced to pay a $1.2 billion fine for those.
And then the more recent alleged crime was they rewarded the execs that were responsible for those moves, and that's why the administration took the action it did. Mm-hmm. Well, let's take a step back and the idea that the global supply chain, might be compromised, it should be scary for everyone in this room. Like, we all own a phone and a computer that is made likely in China. Parts are made in China. Is it just a fact of life? What can be done to take federal intrusion out of, this massive and growing technology business?
Well, hopefully it's not a fact of life, but I do believe that with the growth and how the expeditious manner of what technology is growing, we are not keeping up with the ability to defend cyber capabilities and technology vulnerabilities. And I think that is something that we work really hard in the U.S. is to educate the vulnerabilities that we have, whether it be a cell phone, hardware, software, because every consumer, whether it be an individual or company, want things faster, more expeditious, but yet that's being completed to consumers without a value of security. So what is that sweet spot between technology and security, particularly in the way we communicate every day, which the average person has at least one cellular device, if not 5. How do we ensure that what we are doing on that is being protected by the company that we bought this from, but our own due diligence to protect our data and our information?
Well, what's the answer? How do we ensure it? Do you shop for computers or phones that aren't made in certain parts of the world?
No, I think even if they are made in certain parts of the world, there are mitigations that we all can take into account, whether it be a company-provided phone or your own individual phone. There's software we could buy, there's protective measures, but I think it all starts with awareness. And I think we start with awareness, educating the consumers. They can make their own risk-based decisions.
How can the federal government work more effectively with companies in Silicon Valley and European governments work with European companies? Is there more that can be done in terms of a partnership between public and private entities?
There's much more, and I'd say that the ceiling is limitless as to with the partnership that we can promulgate to defend these issues. For instance, if you are 3 individuals in Silicon Valley, you develop a product that's cutting edge, and that's the American dream, and that you have a company that comes in from another foreign adversary country and wants to invest in your company, it's the American dream, it's capitalism. And then here comes the government saying, well, wait, hold on, that's a dual-use technology, it may be advantageous to our competitor. It becomes very confusing. So I think our effort is to educate and inform Silicon Valley, the tech startups, to the threat. And from the very first day, whether it be the insider threat, but also as they're completing their business process, who would also be interested in your product that may harm national security.
And do you believe that Western adversaries like Russia and China are in Silicon Valley watching what's going on, porting innovations back from London, from Paris, from San Francisco back home?
Absolutely, and I would not limit it to Silicon Valley. I would limit it to all technology giants and places here, and where we are in Paris and Station F. I think anywhere where there's vibrant development of big ideas merged with ingenuity and a competitiveness to succeed is clearly an avenue for our adversaries to watch and learn, and then measure that with what our governments are buying and procuring and investing in.
So in this environment that you're describing, it was startling to read today, I think it was Politico that had a report that the president is resistant to having his iPhone, the one that he uses to tweet, from going through normal White House security protocols. I don't know if you saw that story, but he hadn't had it checked in a couple of months, apparently. Maybe you can't speak to the details of that, but does that alarm you?
Well, I can only speak to the fact that we talked a little bit about the vulnerabilities of telecommunications are not secret, and we all know. And I'm pretty confident that the apparatus of the administration and the folks who protect senior officials, to include the president, are doing their best to mitigate any vulnerabilities or threats posed by anybody's telecommunications, to include the president.
Doing their best with a perhaps hostile subject. One more question on the global supply chain, and then we'll move on. Another aspect of what we've been seeing is the U.S. reluctant to see foreign technology companies buy or merge with U.S. companies. Obviously, Broadcom's attempt to buy Qualcomm being Exhibit A. What's going on there?
Well, I think there's it's multifaceted, right? And it's an opportunity for the U.S. is not only in a partnership with the global economy. I would say it's one of the bigger players in the global economy. So that's aspect one. Number two is protecting our national security. And one would say, I would say, our economic security is our national security. So at what point do you have to have a buffer zone or maybe a yield sign to direct foreign investment to technology firms and businesses in the U.S. that down the road can portray themselves as a threat to national security? I think that's really a difficult spot we're dealing with in the U.S. to understand that, and also look at the ability for us to look 5 years down the road and what does that mosaic look like with respect to securing our capabilities, not only from a capitalistic perspective, but from a national security perspective.
And in the specific case of Broadcom and Qualcomm, did you think that was a reasonable action?
I did. I thought it was.
Okay, well, moving on to the topic of foreign influence in the elections of Western democracies. You get asked a lot, what do we know about the 2016 U.S. presidential election? You had to conduct a review with your boss, James Clapper. My version of that is, what don't we know? Is there still mystery about what happened in the Brexit vote and in the U.S. presidential election?
Well, that's a great question, and I can tell you from our perspective, we know, but there's still a lot we don't know, and I'm sure we'll find out. But
like what?
I think what else was a realm of possibility 2 years ago? And I think when you look at what did happen, what did we miss? And obviously the influence factor was large enough to create the chaos we have now. But learning from that and not getting bogged down in that, I think, is the key element. What can happen this fall in the U.S.? What can happen in 2020? What can happen in Europe? What's the predictive analysis of what our adversaries are capable of with respect to social media, big data, AI, and how can that be manipulated with respect to influencing to me, the biggest issue is influencing the electoral vote, the actual voter who goes to the machine, influencing their mind. At the end of the day, Europe and the US, North America, the biggest thing we have to offer is democracy, or democratic values and institutions, and we have to hold them at the highest level and do everything we can to protect them.
Are Western countries more ready now? Are they ready for the next election cycles?
I believe they are, and I think as you move forward east, I think the eastern countries in Europe have been dealing with this for decades. Right? There's nothing new. The Russian influence in Europe has been there, and it's been there with NATO. I think the U.S. is latecomers to the game, though we can provide and bring to the table a lot of success in solving these problems and joining Europe with defending the democratic values that we have and we hold dearly.
Do you think Russia has gotten the message butt out, and are they likely to heed it?
I think they have, and I think the Russian government and their leader is trying to understand, and for the first time in a long time, how serious we are in the U.S. The indictments that occurred a few months ago, and the sanctions, and the kicking out of the diplomats are a first time ever. And I think this is the first time that Putin is going to have an opportunity to think about what are the consequences. And I think that's a great place for us to be in. And I think to push back, and that not only us, but the decision after what happened in Great Britain was a global decision. There was hundreds of countries that were involved in that. And I think
this was in response to the poisoning of two.
Right. And I think the global coming together against the Russian Federation was, I think, not only the first time, but I think it had a really, really dramatic effect.
So you believe Putin has gotten the message and has responded?
I do.
Okay. We in the press love to heap some amount of blame on the technology companies for facilitating some of this foreign meddling, Facebook, Google, Twitter to some extent. How much blame do you think they deserve? Because no private company is equipped to deal with malicious state actors. And yet, they weren't minding parts of their own business, the ad buying, the fake news. Mark Zuckerberg is about to testify at Parliament in Brussels. How much blame does Mark deserve?
Well, I think blame is probably the wrong word. And I think we could talk about three words that are interrelated: accountability, responsibility, and liability. So I think Mark has some responsibility. I think he's owned up to that as a mega company, and that's global. Also, what is the liability when companies like that sell their data? Cambridge Analytica. So there's just one company of which an organization like Facebook sells derived data from their participants. So there's also some liability to that, right? And I think companies are going to sit back now and think about, wow, who are my third-party vendors I'm selling this data to? What's my liability? What's my accountability? And am I responsible for that data when it leaves my business? I think this is going to be a watershed moment for big data and for companies who really portray themselves in selling our data and owning our data, and what are their liabilities moving forward.
And Christopher Wiley from Cambridge Analytica is speaking at the end of our program tomorrow. But there's a mindset in Silicon Valley: just go fast, outpace your competitors, get big quick. What you're saying is they need to reevaluate that, move a little bit slower, because this growth mindset can be exploited.
I do, and I think they will now. I think understanding that, yes, the speed of which this type of tech business moves is extraordinary. But there is a little bit of setback, and we'll talk about it hopefully in a second on cyber, but the same way with accountability, responsibility, and liability. What is that liability for a company, and are you responsible for the data you give to someone else or sell to someone else? It provides a new optic to the situation.
Right. Okay, well, let's talk about computer security in general. Given the nature of the modern national security threat in the West, do you feel like Western democracies spend enough, pay enough attention to computer security, versus building up traditional military assets? Are we in balance, or would you like to see it shift?
I'd like to see it shift. I'd like to say that we think that we are, but I think the reality is, as governments, whether it be from a military perspective or just general governments, we're doing our best. I think, but we talked about the speed of technology and the cyber capabilities is clearly outpacing our ability to defend against the vulnerabilities and threats that we have. And we have to find a way to close that gap. That delta is very dangerous, not only to governments, but to companies. And I think this is an amazing opportunity for governments worldwide, Europe and North America specifically, to really have a true public-private partnership to understand the capabilities. But we're also fighting for the awesome talent that's out there to come to private sector and government.
They're incentivized to go into the private sector.
That's correct. I will proffer, though. I think that if they get into our space first, we own them for life. I think the national security mission is that powerful that no one leaves. But getting them initially is the biggest challenge we have.
And you also oversee counterintelligence for NATO.
That's correct.
Is the coordination in terms of the computer security threat between countries where it needs to be?
I would say probably not, but that gets a little bit more problematic. I think from our role as leading that counterintelligence panel at NATO is probably more education awareness and what we could do as a consensus against our adversaries. It's hard enough for each individual country to secure their nation and their data. Having more than one or a conglomerate, I think that's a bridge too far.
Right. Yeah. Could there one day be a NATO for cyber threats?
Well, I think each country has to identify its own thoughts and policies on deterrence and what does that look like. And I think there can be there's some European Union movement and NATO movement to try and have some cyber norms. And I think that will help level set some of the issues that we have. But in terms of from a protective nature, I think we see things a little bit differently. And I think securing your data and your information is very not only critical to nation states, but also critical to a business and competitive edge.
How much time do you spend with NATO vis-a-vis the U.S. federal government?
Probably not as much as I should. You know, my role in leading that counterintelligence panel is probably a quarterly in-person basis, but more or less done behind the scenes. We have an annual big all-conference. This year it's going to be in the U.S. We're bringing all of NATO together from a counterintelligence perspective. And I think that's a really great opportunity to, again, the NATO apparatus needs to be one and together and united. And I think that starts with countering the intelligence capabilities of our adversaries.
You talked about governments needing to keep pace with the high velocity of technological change. Well, shifting to the cloud is obviously one big aspect of that. The Pentagon, sort of infamously, is about to award a multi-billion-dollar contract this summer, the so-called JEDI contract. Is the shift to the cloud, does it create new potential vulnerabilities, or do you think that is sort of largely positive for protecting national security?
I think it's both. I think it's certainly positive, and the Pentagon would not be, the Department of Defense would not be the first intelligence community to go to the cloud, clearly. And they're going to learn from some of the best practices and not so best practices of the preceding agencies that have done that. But I will say that the cloud, still in the government, is a vague concept, right? So the average operator, analyst, agent who's working in the field, they remember their information being in their CPU on their desk. So now that it's going to this mythical cloud, we have to work really hard in the government to train. What does that mean? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What is the cloud? And then are we capable of protecting that data in our cloud tomorrow as we are today in our current apparatus? And the training involvement and bringing on very complicated cyber issues and then training our internal folks to secure that is a big challenge.
There's a pretty acrimonious debate in this community right now over whether the JEDI contract should be awarded to one company, potentially Amazon, but who knows, or split up. Do you have a horse in that race?
I don't have a horse in that race, but I can tell you it's been working very well in our other agencies that have that. But there is some value in terms of data protection of the split concept, right? Because if you lose via cyber infiltration or something nefarious happens, if it's multiple locations, the damage is less. So I think theoretically from a risk perspective, that makes more sense. But if it's secured well enough, I think we're okay.
We're running out of time. I want to ask you about insider threats. You worked when you were with the FBI on the Edward Snowden case. In this environment, when data is so easily transferred out of institutions, even federal ones, how do we prevent someone, a discontented employee or government contractor from doing it again?
Right. So our organization also leads the nation's insider threat program. So we do a lot of training and guide organizations in the government on the principles of insider threat. And I think that really sets the tone for this conversation about what does it look like, that insider. And I think the insider threat is still our number one most vicious threat that we face in the government. Also say it's in the private sector, right? Your competitors, your insider threat, the human-enabled activity in the company or the government is number one on our threat basis. So that person, has key indicators that we have, and we look for those key indicators not only from a social perspective, but on a monitoring perspective. And, I would argue that, the key indicators are oftentimes our best leaders. right?
Well, one indicator is that, and this was certainly the case with Snowden, is that they feel like they're not being heard, right? They are discontent, they raise something, and they're rebuffed. So is it potentially around kind of listening to some of these people? Can you get them, can you prevent another Snowden from happening that way?
Absolutely, and I think the human element, understanding your employees, knowing who you hire, and then having the opportunity to have those conversations with your boss, and if you have a disenfranchised employee is critical. Also, I think we have to have a really vibrant and valued whistleblower programs in the government, so that if you have a disenfranchised employee, there is a place to go to complain about something you feel is wrong versus going to the media.
All right, we're running out of time, and I have some miscellaneous questions for you here. Some wild cards. I am personally the owner of 4 Amazon Alexas, Echo speakers in my house, taking my commands. Would you put an Alexa or a Google Home or an Apple Siri device in your house?
Not only would I, but I do.
Okay.
I also own Alexa, and she is wonderful to our family. However, my 19-month-old is almost able to say Alexa, which is problematic. So we might change her name soon to make that. But I think that you bring up a great point. The Internet of Things is so complicated. It's so fast, and it's expeditious, and it's being done because as consumers we want things so fast, but what's not being put in place is the viable security. And
I mean, do you believe when Amazon says we only record this snippet after you say the word Alexa? Do you believe that, or is this an eavesdropping device in our homes?
Well, I prefer not to comment about that particular issue. I can tell you that when I don't use Alexa, I put it on mute, and I make sure I'm judicious on my iPad and understanding what the capabilities are. And I do my own personal hygiene in my own product to enhance our protection measures at home.
Interesting. Okay, so you mute it, so you don't want it just sitting there on standby.
That's correct.
Interesting. Very, very good Alexa hygiene. So 20 seconds left. Last question. This is a strange one. I think this show is on in Europe. In the U.S., we have a show called The Americans. It's about the sort of espionage world of the 80s, I think. Do you watch it? What do you think? What does it get right?
Religiously.
What does it get wrong?
It gets a lot right. It gets a lot of the tradecraft utilized back in the 80s and 90s. Correct. It gets the surveillance, the construct, the stress between two nations vying for power, and I think the ability for us in our world to finally see a show that does the technical part of intelligence and counterintelligence, right, is exciting to us in the community, and I am a big watcher of it.
All right, Bill Evanina, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Brad.